Picture this. It's a cool spring evening in 1923, and the Pine Ridge Community Hall is packed tighter than a Civil War-era troop transport. Oil lamps flicker against the rough-hewn walls, casting dancing shadows that seem to mirror the tension, crackling through the room like electricity before a thunderstorm. And there, standing before the semicircle of weathered wooden chairs that house the town's most respected elders, is 28-year-old Joseph Harker. Now, Joe isn't your typical small-town troublemaker. This isn't some wild-eyed dreamer or saloon brawler looking to stir up excitement on a Saturday night. No, Joseph Harker is something far more dangerous to a tight-knit community like Pine Ridge. He's a man with a plan that makes absolutely no sense to anyone but himself. Look at those hands of his as he stands there, steady as bedrock, despite the storm of voices swirling around him. These are carpenter's hands, scarred and calloused from years of working, with wood and iron, hands that inherited more than just their skill from his father. When railway engineer Thomas Harker died in 1898, crushed beneath a derailed locomotive while building one of America's iron roads through the Montana wilderness, he left his son something precious. A leather satchel filled with blueprints, engineering calculations, and an obsession with structures that shouldn't exist. For 25 years, those blueprints had gathered dust in Joe's modest cabin, but now, as Elder Thomas Brennan's voice rises to fill every corner of the meeting hall, we're witnessing the moment when inheritance becomes inspiration, when a dead man's dreams awaken in his son's soul. You want to do what? Brennan's words cut through the murmur of the crowd like a cavalry saber. The elder's face, carved by decades of Montana winters, shows the kind of disbelief typically reserved for men claiming they've seen flying machines or spoken with spirits. Joe's response comes calm and measured, each word deliberately chosen. I intend to build a cabin on Devil's Crown Peak. The silence that follows is the kind you hear before avalanches, before tornadoes, before the earth itself decides to remind humanity of its place in the natural order. Because everyone in that room, every man, woman, and child who spent their life in the shadow of those mountains, knows exactly what Devil's Crown Peak represents. This isn't just any mountain we're talking about, folks. Devil's Crown stands 8,300 feet above sea level. Its summit, a jagged granite spire that claws at the Montana sky like an accusation against God himself. The Shoshone chief White Elk warned the first settlers about this place back in 1871, speaking in words that the territorial interpreter translated as, "the mountain that breaks men's bones and steals their spirits." And White Elk wasn't speaking in metaphors. 7 men had died attempting to conquer Devil's Crown in the 52 years since white settlers first laid eyes on it. 7 deaths, each one carved into Pine Ridge's collective memory like notches on a gunfighter's pistol. There were the Garrett brothers in 1905, buried alive when their ambitious mining survey triggered an avalanche that wouldn't give up their bodies until the spring thaw. Surveyor Michael Crow disappeared in 1915, leaving behind only a shredded rope and bloodstains on granite that the winter snow couldn't wash away. But here's Joseph Harker, carpenter's son and railway orphan, proposing not just to climb this killer mountain, but to live on it, to build a permanent structure where nature itself seems determined to prevent human habitation. The community Joe was preparing to leave behind wasn't just any collection of pioneer families scratching out existence on the frontier. Pine Ridge in 1923 was something special, a place where neighbors became family, through shared labor and mutual dependence. Saturday barn raisings, where 30 men could frame and roof a structure before sunset, working with the synchronized precision of a military unit. Harvest festivals where young Joseph had danced with merchant daughters under strings of lantern light, their laughter mixing with fiddle music, and the promise of futures built on fertile valley soil. There were the Sunday dinners at the Brennan house, where Elder Thomas would hold court at the head of a table, groaning under the weight of roasted venison and fresh-baked bread. Joe had been a regular at that table, courting Thomas's daughter Elizabeth with the patient determination of a man building something meant to last generations. But for 3 years, while Pine Ridge lived its comfortable cycle of seasons and certainties, Joseph Harker had been preparing for something else entirely. 3 years of secret study, poring over geological surveys by lamplight while his neighbors slept. 3 Years of saving every penny earned from his carpentry work, $1,700 accumulated coin by coin, a fortune that represented countless hours of honest labor. He'd learned survival skills from old Magnus, the hermit trapper who lived in a one-room shack 5 miles up Beaver Creek. Magnus was the kind of man who could track a wounded elk through 3 counties and start a fire in a blizzard using nothing but flint and determination. Under his tutelage, Joe learned to read weather patterns in cloud formations, to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, to move through wilderness with the silent efficiency of a predator. The final confrontation came when Joe announced his intention to trade away his inheritance 40 acres of the most fertile valley land in 3 counties, soil so rich it could grow corn tall enough to hide a mounted rider. This wasn't just property we're talking about. This was security, legacy, the foundation upon which Pine Ridge families built their futures. His younger brother Samuel wept openly when Joe signed the papers, tears of a man watching his only remaining family member choose madness over stability. The land would go to Samuel, along with the burden of explaining to future generations why the Harker name disappeared from the valley. But it was Elizabeth Brennan who delivered the killing blow. Standing in the doorway of her father's house on a cold March morning, she pulled the promise ring from her finger, a simple band of Montana silver that Joe had crafted with his own hands, and threw it at his feet with enough force to chip the wooden step. "You're not the man I thought you were, Joseph Harker," she said, her voice carrying the kind of finality usually reserved for funeral orations. Joe picked up the ring, held it to the light for a moment, then looked back at the woman he'd planned to marry, the community he'd called home, the safe and sensible life spreading out before him like a well-maintained road. "I'd rather fail reaching for the sky," he said, "than succeed living in fear." And with those words, Joseph Harker became Mountain Joe, a man who would trade everything certain for something impossible. The question that hangs in the air as our story begins is simple. What drives a man to abandon everything safe and familiar for a dream that will probably kill him? The answer lies waiting 8,000 feet above sea level, where the wind never stops howling and the granite peaks scrape against the belly of God himself. May 19th, 24 finds Mountain Joe making his first real assault on Devil's Crown Peak. And folks, what we're about to witness is engineering ambition colliding head-on with the raw, unforgiving mathematics of vertical granite. Joe didn't just wake up one morning and decide to scramble up a mountain like some weekend adventurer looking for bragging rights at the local saloon. No, this was a calculated siege, planned with the methodical precision his railway engineer father would have recognized and approved. Every handhold on that 2,000-foot vertical climb had been studied, calculated, and mapped using principles that Thomas Harker had applied to bridging impossible gorges for the railroad companies. Picture the scene. A lone figure moving up a wall of stone that rises as sheer and unforgiving as the side of a cathedral, but this cathedral was built by geological forces that make human architecture look like children's toys. Each rope anchor point had been tested with mathematical precision. Joe would hang his entire body weight from every piton, every bolt, every knot before trusting his life to it. Because on Devil's Crown, there are no second chances, no do-overs, no margin for the kind of sloppy thinking that might cost a carpenter a thumb, but would cost a climber everything. The material transport system Joe devised was nothing short of ingenious. Using salvaged mining equipment, pulleys and cables rescued from abandoned copper claims scattered throughout the Montana wilderness, he created a 3-stage lifting network that could haul 200 pounds of supplies at a time up that impossible face. Think about that for a moment. 200 pounds. That's the equivalent of lifting a full-grown man, along with his gear, his food, his tools, his hopes and dreams, straight up through thin air for distances that would make an eagle dizzy. But genius comes with a price, and Joe was about to learn that lesson written in blood and measured in pounds of flesh. The physical toll began almost immediately. Those carpenter's hands that had seemed so steady in the Pine Ridge meeting hall, within a week they were bleeding through leather gloves that had been soaked and re-soaked in neat's foot oil for flexibility. The rope burns on his shoulders cut through shirts, through skin, leaving raw wounds that made every movement a reminder of gravity's relentless pull toward the earth below. By the end of June, Joe's body told the story of his ambition. His weight dropped from 180 pounds, the solid, well-fed frame of a successful valley carpenter, to 150 pounds of sinew and determination. His face took on the gaunt, haunted look of Civil War soldiers photographed after months of hard campaigning. But his eyes, those eyes burned with a fire that seemed to grow brighter as his body grew thinner. The summer of 1924 brought challenges that no amount of planning could have anticipated, because Mother Nature has a way of testing human presumption with creative cruelty that would make a medieval torturer take notes. July 15th brought Caesar. Now, when I say Caesar, I'm not talking about some Roman emperor or ambitious politician. I'm talking about 800 pounds of Montana grizzly bear, a creature that had probably been ruling this particular stretch of wilderness since before the first white man ever laid eyes on Devil's Crown. And Caesar was not pleased to discover that his territory had been invaded by a peculiar human who insisted on hauling supplies up vertical rock faces. The attack came at dawn, when Joe was reorganizing his carefully accumulated supply cache at the base of the mountain. Picture this. You're 1,000 miles from the nearest helping hand, armed with nothing but hand tools, and the survival instincts old Magnus had drilled into you during those long winter nights by Beaver Creek. Caesar emerges from the morning mist like something out of a nightmare, moving with the deceptive speed that makes grizzlies the apex predators of the American wilderness. Joe's only weapon was his father's cavalry saber, a blade that Thomas Harker had carried during the Indian Wars, now pressed into service against an enemy that would have made Sitting Bull's warriors look like Sunday school children. The battle lasted 20 minutes, that felt like 20 hours, man and beast circling each other in a dance older than civilization itself. When the dust settled, both combatants were bloodied but breathing. Joe bore 3 parallel claw marks across his ribs that would scar him for life, while Caesar nursed a sword cut across his massive shoulder that probably taught him a healthy respect for this strange two-legged intruder. From that day forward, an odd understanding existed between them. Caesar would watch Joe's activities from a respectful distance, and Joe would leave portions of his food supplies where the bear could find them without compromising the main cache. August brought a different kind of test, one that would forge an alliance as unexpected as his détente with Caesar. 7-year-old Anna Chen was the daughter of Wei Chen, a traveling merchant whose family followed the seasonal trading routes between the mining camps and settled communities of the Montana Territory. When Anna wandered away from her family's wagon train during a rest stop at the base of Devil's Crown, she became lost in the maze of granite formations and narrow ledges that made up the mountain's lower reaches. Joe discovered her 3 days later, hypothermic and barely conscious, trapped on a ledge 500 feet above the valley floor. The rescue required every skill he'd learned during his months on the mountain. Rope work that would have impressed a Navy rigger, weather prediction that told him he had maybe 2 hours before an incoming lightning storm turned the granite face into a death trap, and the kind of steady nerves that separate heroes from corpses. Lowering Anna 500 feet in a makeshift harness, while lightning began to fork across the sky, was probably the most terrifying thing Joe had ever attempted. But when Wei Chen saw his daughter alive and unharmed, delivered safely to his arms by this wild-haired mountain hermit, a debt was created that would prove invaluable in the months to come. Every week thereafter, Chen's supply wagon would make a detour to Devil's Crown, carrying carefully selected provisions that Joe had requested. Medical supplies, specialized tools, even books to occupy the long winter nights that lay ahead. Anna would wave from the wagon seat, her bright eyes following Joe's progress up the mountain face with the kind of hero worship that only children can maintain. But it was Joe's construction innovations that truly separated this endeavor from mere adventure-seeking. The wedding cake foundation, he designed a series of terraced platforms that distributed the cabin's weight across the narrow mountain ledge, was engineering decades ahead of its time. Instead of fighting the mountain's natural contours, Joe worked with them, creating a structure that seemed to grow from the granite itself. His revolutionary use of local ponderosa pine's natural resin as weatherproofing would later be studied by architects looking to build in extreme environments. But in 1924, it was simply the desperate innovation of a man who understood that traditional building methods wouldn't survive the first Montana winter at 8,000 feet. By October's first snow, The walls stood 12 feet high, rising from the granite like something that had always belonged there. Joe's journal entry from October 15th captured both his exhaustion and his determination. "The mountain tests me daily. Today it taught me patience when wind destroyed a month's work in minutes. Tomorrow I begin again, wiser." Those words, "tomorrow I begin again, wiser," would become Mountain Joe's unofficial motto, the philosophy that would carry him through trials that would break lesser men. But as that first winter approached, Joe had no idea that his greatest challenges still lay ahead, waiting in the frozen months when Devil's Crown would show him what true isolation really meant. Spring 1926 arrives on Devil's Crown like a promise kept, and with it comes the completion of something that shouldn't exist. Mountain Joe's cabin, standing 16 feet by 20 feet against the Montana sky, its walls 18 inches thick, and designed with innovations that wouldn't be seen in mainstream architecture for another generation. This isn't just shelter we're talking about. Folks, this is an engineering marvel perched on a ledge barely wide enough for a railroad car, 8,000 feet above sea level, where the air is thin enough to make every breath a conscious effort. The snow load dispersing roof design Joe developed could handle the kind of winter accumulation that would crush conventional structures like matchboxes. Every beam, every joint, every carefully planned angle represents months of calculation and years of dreaming. But here's where our story takes a turn that even Mountain Joe couldn't have anticipated. Word of the impossible cabin began to spread through those mysterious channels that carry news across frontier territories faster than telegraph wires. Traders told miners, miners told loggers, loggers told farmers, and farmers told their wives around kitchen tables in towns Joe had never heard of. And people started coming. Not hordes. Mind you, this wasn't some tourist destination with guidebooks and comfortable lodging. These were individuals drawn by something deeper than curiosity. People who heard about a man living in defiance of gravity and common sense and felt compelled to witness it for themselves. Joe established rules without ever writing them down, understanding that his mountain sanctuary needed protection from the kind of casual visitors who might treat it like a weekend camping spot. Every guest had to carry up their own supplies, no exceptions. They had to leave the site cleaner than they found it, understanding that at 8,000 feet, there's no margin for carelessness. And most importantly, they had to share either a skill or a story, contributing something to the unique culture that was emerging on Devil's Crown. The exchanges that resulted created something unprecedented in the American wilderness, a place where a university philosophy professor might spend an afternoon teaching Latin conjugations, while Mountain Joe demonstrated the finer points of rope splicing, where a bankrupt businessman from Helena, broken by the economic uncertainties of the 1920s, could find new purpose, helping Joe expand his storage shed, discovering that hands-on labor possessed a therapeutic value that no doctor could prescribe. These weren't just social visits. They were transformations. Moments when people discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed. The mountain had a way of stripping away pretense, reducing human interaction to its most essential elements: competence, honesty, and mutual dependence. And then, in June 1926, Sarah McKay arrived. Sarah wasn't like the other visitors. Where they came seeking inspiration or adventure, she came with skepticism sharp enough to cut granite. The educated daughter of Theodore McKay, Pine Ridge's largest merchant, she possessed the kind of formal schooling that was rare among frontier women. Her first words to Joe, delivered while standing on his carefully constructed platform, hands on her hips, studying his impossible creation with critical eyes, were, "I came to see if fools can fly." That opening salvo began a courtship unlike anything the Montana Territory had ever witnessed. Instead of parlor visits and chaperoned buggy rides, Joe and Sarah conducted their relationship through written notes, left in a hollowed tree at the 2,000-foot mark. Climbing to retrieve those messages became a daily ritual for Joe, each ascent and descent a physical manifestation of emotional investment. Sarah's letters revealed a mind as sharp and uncompromising as the mountain itself. She challenged Joe's motivations, questioned his methods, demanded explanations for choices that most people simply accepted as the eccentricities of a mountain hermit. But underneath the intellectual sparring lay something deeper, recognition between two people who had never quite fit the conventional expectations of their time and place. By August, their correspondence had evolved from challenge to collaboration. Sarah began suggesting improvements to Joe's water collection system, drawing on her father's merchant experience with hydraulic equipment. She proposed a more efficient layout for his workshop area, applying principles she'd learned while helping manage the McKay family's complex trading operations. Their September wedding, performed by traveling preacher Josiah Mills, took place on the platform Joe had built, with only the wind and the vast Montana sky as witnesses. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to accommodate the practical realities of mountain living but still carrying the elegance that had made her the most sought-after young woman in Pine Ridge. Joe wore his father's cavalry uniform, cleaned and pressed for the occasion, the brass buttons catching the afternoon sun like signals of hope transmitted across impossible distances. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. The celebration lasted 3 days, as wedding guests, an unlikely collection of mountain visitors, local trappers, and even Caesar the Grizzly, observing from a respectful distance, shared food, stories, and the kind of genuine joy that comes from witnessing something pure and authentic in a world often defined by compromise. Sarah's presence transformed the Spartan cabin into something approaching a home. She brought books, volumes of poetry, philosophy, and practical knowledge that filled shelves Joe constructed in alcoves carved from the granite walls themselves. She established a window garden where herbs grew in carefully tended soil carried up the mountain one handful at a time. Her laughter echoed off those granite walls, a sound that seemed to prove that human happiness could flourish, even in the most unlikely environments. Most importantly, she brought dreams of the future. Children who would inherit their parents' courage, a new generation raised above the clouds with perspectives unconstrained by valley thinking. They planned expansions to the cabin, improvements to the supply system, maybe even a second structure for visitors who wished to stay longer. December 27th, 1926, shattered those dreams with the brutal efficiency of a rifle shot. The blizzard that trapped them for 6 days was the kind of storm that remakes landscapes, moving snow like a sentient force determined to bury anything foolish enough to challenge its dominion. But blizzards, even monster storms, were challenges Joe had prepared for. The cabin's design included provisions for extended isolation, food stores, fuel supplies, emergency equipment. What he hadn't prepared for was Sarah going into labor 6 weeks early, her body responding to some internal calendar that paid no attention to weather conditions or mountain logistics. For 3 days, Joe watched helplessly as Sarah fought a battle he couldn't join. His desperate attempts to summon help, mirror signals flashed toward the valley during brief breaks in the storm, fire beacons that consumed precious fuel, even a nearly suicidal descent attempt that ended with Joe dangling from a rope in zero visibility, saved from falling only by his instinctive understanding of the mountain's geography, all proved futile. The valley might as well have been on another planet. Sarah and their son, whom they named Thomas for the mountain peaks that had brought them together, died as the storm finally broke on December 28th. Joe's journal, which had faithfully recorded every detail of mountain life for 3 years, went silent for 3 months. When the entries resumed in March 1927, they contained only a single line: "The mountain gave me everything, then took everything. Still I remain." Those words, "Still I remain," would define the final chapter of Mountain Joe's story. As a man who had lost everything discovered what it truly meant to choose purpose over comfort, meaning over safety. But that's a story for our next chapter, when we'll witness Joe's transformation from grieving widower to something approaching a frontier prophet, and discover how personal tragedy can sometimes forge the kind of wisdom that speaks across generations. 1927 through 1929 chronicles Mountain Joe's transformation from grieving widower to something frontier Montana had never seen before. A reluctant sage whose very existence challenged every assumption about what human life could become. The visitors kept coming, drawn now not just by curiosity about the impossible cabin, but by something deeper, stories of a man who had faced the ultimate test and emerged not broken, but refined, like steel tempered in fire that burns hot enough to forge miracles. But these weren't the same casual adventurers who had climbed Devil's Crown in earlier years. Word of Sarah's death had spread through the frontier communities, transforming Mountain Joe from eccentric hermit into something approaching legend. The people who made the difficult climb now came seeking answers to questions they couldn't articulate, hoping to understand how a person continues when everything they've built crumbles in their hands. Young Theodore Brennan, son of the very elder who had opposed Joe's original plan, arrived in the spring of 1928, his face carrying the hollow expression of a man who had watched drought turn his carefully tended farmland into cracked earth and broken dreams. The family farm that had fed 3 generations of Brennans was gone, sold to pay debts that accumulated faster than Montana topsoil blew away in the relentless wind. Joe found Theodore sitting on the platform at sunrise, staring across the valley toward land that was no longer his, tears freezing on his cheeks in the thin mountain air. What happened next was typical of the man Mountain Joe had become. No speeches, no philosophical lectures, just practical work that somehow contained all the wisdom a broken heart could absorb. Together, they spent 2 weeks expanding the cabin's foundation, Theodore learning that hands engaged in useful labor could quiet a mind tormented by failure. When he descended the mountain, he carried with him more than just memories of physical work. He had discovered that human worth isn't measured by property owned or social position maintained, but by the willingness to continue building something meaningful, even when the previous structure has collapsed. Maria Santos arrived in the summer of 1928, fleeing an arranged marriage to a man twice her age, who viewed women as property to be acquired and managed. She climbed Devil's Crown in a wedding dress, the only clothes she owned besides. Work garments, having walked away from her family's ranch the night before the ceremony was scheduled to take place. Joe found her exhausted and hypothermic at the 3,000-foot mark, her expensive dress torn and stained, but her eyes blazing with the kind of determination he recognized in his own mirror. She stayed for 3 months, learning skills that would allow her to survive independently. Rope work, weather prediction, the kind of practical knowledge that transforms helpless victims into self-sufficient individuals. When Maria finally descended, she carried detailed plans for her own mountain retreat, a smaller structure designed for a single occupant, hidden in a canyon 50 miles north where she could live according to her own choices, rather than society's expectations. Her success inspired other women facing similar circumstances, and by 1929, there were 4 such refuges scattered across the Montana wilderness, all based on engineering principles, refined on Devil's Crown. Each visitor added something to Joe's growing collection of philosophical manuscripts, meditations on solitude, courage, and the price of authentic living that he wrote by lamplight during the long winter nights. These weren't formal treatises intended for publication, but rather honest reflections from a man who had tested every assumption about human potential against the unforgiving reality of 8,000 feet above sea level. The writing that emerged contained insights that would inspire generations of seekers, philosophers, and anyone who had ever wondered whether conventional success was worth the sacrifice of individual authenticity. Joe wrote about the difference between safety and security, explaining that true security comes not from avoiding risk, but from developing the skills and character necessary to handle whatever challenges arise. He explored the relationship between solitude and loneliness, arguing that the person who cannot be alone with themselves will never be truly comfortable with others. His observations about the connection between physical challenge and emotional growth anticipated developments in psychology that wouldn't be formally recognized for decades. But it was the winter of 1929 that would write the final chapter of Mountain Joe's story, bringing the catastrophic conditions he had long predicted and the ultimate test of everything he had learned during 6 years on Devil's Crown. The snowpack that accumulated during that winter was unprecedented in recorded Montana history. Week after week, storm systems moved across the territory like an army of occupation, each one depositing layers of snow and ice that built upon previous accumulations with mathematical precision. By February, the depth at high elevations exceeded 20 feet, enough to bury a 2-story building and still have enough left over to hide a mounted horseman. Joe's journal entries from that period read like weather reports written by a man who understood that he was witnessing something extraordinary and potentially catastrophic. His engineering background allowed him to calculate load factors and stress points that would be invisible to casual observers. What he saw forming above Pine Ridge was a disaster waiting for the right trigger. The trigger came in the form of sudden warming during the first week of March. Temperatures that had remained below freezing for months jumped 30 degrees in 2 days, turning the bottom layers of the snowpack into a foundation of ice and water that could no longer support the massive weight pressing down from above. On March 15, 1929, Mountain Joe descended from Devil's Crown for the first time in 3 years. He carried 20 pounds of dynamite, carefully acquired through trading relationships with Chinese railroad workers who understood the controlled use of explosives in dangerous terrain. His warning to Pine Ridge was simple and direct: evacuate immediately, or face destruction when the ice dam above the valley inevitably failed. Most people looked at this wild-haired mountain hermit and saw only the ravings of a man too long isolated from civilized society. But old Chief White Elk, the same Shoshone leader who had warned the original settlers about Devil's Crown 58 years earlier, took one look at Joe's weather-beaten face and nodded with the respect of one expert, acknowledging another. White Elk's endorsement carried enough weight to convince the tribal families to move to higher ground. Their departure prompted some of the white settlers to reconsider, but many remained skeptical until they saw the mathematics of Joe's calculations scratched into the dirt with a stick, showing load factors and failure points with the precision of a trained engineer. 200 lives were saved by that warning, though many of the survivors wouldn't understand their debt until much later. March 16th brought the controlled explosion that prevented uncontrolled catastrophe. Joe's placement of the dynamite charges, using principles his father had applied to railroad construction through dangerous mountain passes, created a series of smaller avalanches that relieved pressure on the main ice dam before it could fail catastrophically. The explosion also destroyed Mountain Joe's beloved cabin. 6 years of labor and innovation swept away in seconds by tons of water and debris that reshaped the entire face of Devil's Crown. Joe's final recorded words, spoken to witness Margaret Chen Anna's older sister, now grown to young womanhood, were delivered as he watched his life's work disappear into the valley below. Stone and wood are temporary. The courage to build them is eternal. March 17th brought another blizzard, the kind of storm that seems designed to erase human presence from the landscape entirely. Mountain Joe walked into that storm and was never seen again, though some claim they still see his lantern on impossible nights when the wind carries voices from the high places where eagles fear to nest. Modern climbers discovered his perfectly preserved journal in 1991, wrapped in Sarah's wedding dress and hidden in a cave that required technical climbing skills to reach. The journal contained architectural drawings decades ahead of their time, designs for structures that could withstand extreme weather, efficient systems for high-altitude living, innovations that would later influence everything from space station design to emergency shelter construction. But more valuable than the technical innovations were the philosophical insights, reflections on courage, authenticity, and the relationship between individual choice and community responsibility that launched 1,000 expeditions, not all of them to physical mountains. The foundation stones of Joe's cabin, arranged in a perfect circle by unknown hands, remain untouched by avalanche or time. Visitors still leave offerings there, letters seeking guidance, small tokens of respect, flowers that bloom impossibly at 8,000 feet. The site has become an unofficial shrine to the idea that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they choose meaning over comfort, purpose over security. Mountain Joe's legacy lives not in the structures he built, those were indeed temporary, as he himself acknowledged, but in the courage he demonstrated and the question he posed through his very existence. What might you accomplish if you stopped letting fear make your decisions? That question echoes still across the Montana wilderness, carried by the wind that never stops howling around Devil's Crown Peak, where a man once proved that the only limits on human potential are the ones we accept without testing. Some say he's still up there, building something new in places where mapmakers fear to venture, his lantern a beacon for anyone brave enough to trade the certain for the possible. And maybe, just maybe, they're right.